The lights were dimming in the school auditorium, the murmurs of excited parents gradually fading into an expectant silence. Tonight wasn't just any ordinary school play. This was the annual production, and it meant everything to the kids. It was their moment to shine, their chance to step into someone else's shoes and, for once, feel like heroes. But for 12-year-old Max, it meant more than that. Max had always been different. Not because of his courage, his wit, or his determination. But because he had a disability. A disability that made simple tasks more difficult than they seemed for other kids. But tonight, he was the hero. He had worked tirelessly, practicing his lines, perfecting his moves, never once letting his condition define him. To him, this role was a testament to his hard work, his passion, and his refusal to be seen as less than anyone else. His mother, Sarah, sat in the front row, her eyes gleaming with pride. She had been his biggest supporter, always encouraging him, even when others doubted him. Sarah's hands clutched the edge of her seat, her heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Max, with his unshakable resolve, was about to take center stage. She couldn't help but feel the butterflies in her stomach. Was he nervous? She had been by his side through every struggle, every obstacle, and now, she was here, waiting to see him conquer the biggest challenge of all, proving that a disabled kid could be the hero. As the curtain lifted, a collective gasp filled the air, and the audience leaned forward. The stage was set. Max, in a gleaming costume, stood tall, ready for his cue. The story was one of bravery, adventure, and hope. Max had worked so hard to embody the role of the hero, and tonight, it was finally happening. But then, something shifted. Max's line, which should have been followed by applause, was drowned out by a sudden, deafening noise. A single, sharp crack split the air, cutting through the warmth of the room and sending shockwaves through the crowd. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The audience was still, suspended in disbelief. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could react, her gaze locked onto Karen, the woman who had been seated several rows behind her, whose face was twisted with a strange, almost sinister, look of satisfaction. Karen had always been a presence in their lives, loud, domineering, and at times, a voice of unwarranted criticism. She had never been one to shy away from voicing her opinions about Max's role in society. Sarah had always dismissed her comments as the ramblings of someone who didn't understand, but tonight, everything felt different. The shooting wasn't a mistake. It couldn't have been. Mom? Max's voice trembled from the stage, the fear in his eyes obvious even from a distance. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she sprang to her feet, her world tilting dangerously as she rushed toward the stage. Was he okay? Was he hurt? Disabled kid can't be the hero, Karen's voice rang out from the back, cutting through the chaos that had ensued. You should have never let him play that role. The audience gasped, the tension palpable. Sarah's heart raced as her eyes met Karen's, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the woman's cruel words. The gunshot had not been an accident. Karen's disdain for Max had culminated in this moment, a moment that would change everything. And as Sarah's feet carried her toward the stage, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just an attack on her son, it was a declaration of war. The play had come to an abrupt halt. But the true drama was only just beginning. The auditorium was still buzzing with the echoes of the gunshot, but the world around Sarah seemed to slow down. Her pulse raced in her ears as she pushed through the crowd, desperate to reach the stage. She could see Max from a distance, his body frozen in place, still gripping the wooden sword for his heroic role. The other kids were scattered, some crouching on the floor, some running in panic, but Max didn't move. His eyes, wide with confusion, scanned the room as though trying to comprehend what had just shattered the serenity of the night. Max had always been the type to internalize his emotions, never letting anyone see his vulnerabilities. His disability wasn't something he liked to talk about, but it was a part of him that made everything he did a little bit harder. As Sarah watched her son, she saw the way his body trembled, his legs unsteady as if they had turned to jelly beneath him. But despite all of that, Max had always had an unyielding spirit. He didn't want to be defined by his disability. He wanted to be the hero of his own story. Tonight, he had earned that role. Max's condition, cerebral palsy, had never been an easy thing for him to cope with. The physical limitations, the awkwardness of movement, and the constant need for extra effort were things most people never noticed. But Max's determination to live beyond those constraints was something his mother admired deeply. Sarah remembered when Max had first joined the school play auditions. He had hesitated, unsure if he was even allowed to participate. After all, he had always been the kid in the back, the one with the special needs. But when he got the lead role, the hero, Sarah had known it meant the world to him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice cutting through the chaos. "It's a disgrace." Sarah whipped her head around to see Karen standing in the back row, glaring at the stage. Karen, a fellow parent, had always been outspoken. She was never shy about her opinions on the school's decisions, especially when it came to things that didn't fit her idea of normal. Sarah had long brushed off Karen's harsh judgments, dismissing them as the ramblings of a woman who had nothing better to do with her life. But tonight something felt off. Karen's tone was different. There was a venom in her words, a deep-rooted disdain that didn't belong in a school play, of all places. Max, frozen in place, looked to his mother. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the silent plea for reassurance that everything was going to be okay. His eyes flickered from Sarah to Karen, then back to the stage, where his classmates were still stunned by the shocking disruption. "What's wrong with that kid? Can't they see he's not fit for the role?" Karen muttered to herself, though loud enough for those around her to hear. Her voice was laced with sarcasm. "A disabled kid, playing the hero. It's ridiculous." Sarah's blood boiled at the words. She could feel her chest tighten with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been here before, had dealt with Karen's barbed comments, her passive-aggressive behavior toward Max. But something about tonight, about the gunshot, made everything feel different. Karen's voice had been loud and clear. There was no hiding her feelings anymore. "Karen, that's enough," a mother nearby whispered, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But Karen didn't stop. Her eyes remained glued to the stage, her words sharp, cutting through the tension. "You can't just throw these kids into the spotlight like this. They need to know their place. The real heroes, the ones who matter, are the ones who can stand tall. Not these kids with conditions." The crowd around her seemed to shift uneasily, whispers of disagreement muttering through the aisles. Sarah's heart pounded as she moved toward the back of the room. She needed to say something to Karen, to put an end to her toxic words. But before she could approach, Karen raised her voice again, louder this time. "Do you think they'll let a disabled kid lead? Does anyone even believe he could be a hero?" Karen sneered, eyes flicking toward Max. "Heroes don't stumble through their lines. Heroes don't need help to walk. Heroes don't need special treatment." Max's hands tightened around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had heard Karen. He had heard every word. But unlike most children, Max didn't shrink. He didn't run. He stood there, his face flushed with a mix of anger and determination. He wasn't just fighting for the role, he was fighting for something deeper, something more personal. This was his moment to prove that he could stand on his own, to prove to everyone, including Karen, that he was capable, that he wasn't defined by his disability. Sarah reached the back of the auditorium, her voice barely audible as she spoke to Karen. "You've crossed the line, Karen," she said, her words steady but filled with cold fury. "This isn't about who can or can't be a hero. This is about my son's courage. He has earned his place just like anyone else." Karen turned to Sarah, her face twisted in contempt. I'm just speaking the truth. He shouldn't be the center of attention. You're only setting him up for failure. Sarah's breath quickened, her fingers itching to grab Karen by the shoulders and shake some sense into her. But before she could respond, a flash of movement caught her eye. Max's leg wobbled. He was struggling to maintain his balance. Was it the weight of Karen's words that finally broke him, or was it the sudden pressure of the moment, with the spotlight so harsh on him? And then, just as quickly, a voice rang out from the back of the room, Karen's voice again, louder, more filled with rage than before. That's it. He's ruining everything. It's time someone took control of this situation. The room seemed to hold its breath. Max's eyes flickered up toward the audience. The unspoken message was clear: Karen wasn't going to stop. And neither would he. The auditorium was suffocating with tension, the kind that felt like it could snap at any moment. The noise from the gunshot had only just begun to fade, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to settle over everyone like a thick blanket. Sarah's heart was still racing in her chest as she stared at Max, frozen on stage. Her eyes flicked to Karen, who stood near the back, her hands now raised as if to justify her actions. Everything seemed to slow down. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp as the chaos from the moment of the gunshot continued to pulse in Sarah's mind. Max's body trembled, his once confident stance faltering as his legs wobbled beneath him. It was as if the gunshot had shattered his strength, the impact not just physical but emotional. He'd worked so hard for this moment, to prove that he wasn't just a disabled kid, that he could be the hero. But now, all of that seemed to hang in the balance as he stood on the stage, still gripping his sword, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched her son. Every mother's worst nightmare seemed to be unfolding in front of her, her child in danger, in distress, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. And then she heard it. Karen's voice, sharp and cold, rang out, cutting through the stunned silence. See? This is exactly what I was talking about. A disabled kid can't be the hero. Sarah felt her blood run cold. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. For a split second, she couldn't breathe. Max, standing there, clearly affected by the words, seemed to shrink, his posture breaking even more under the weight of Karen's cruelty. But it wasn't just the words that hit like a punch in the gut, it was the gunshot. The deafening sound that had caused chaos in the audience, parents scrambling in panic, children screaming, and the entire room thrown into a state of utter shock. Max, the kid who had spent months rehearsing for this moment, had become a victim of a cruel, twisted philosophy. Karen's belief that some people didn't deserve to be heroes had become reality, except she had taken it too far, bringing violence into the equation. The moment of panic was relentless. Parents in the audience were leaping from their seats, shoving past one another in a mad rush to reach the exits. Children were crying, some dropping to the floor, others fleeing behind the curtains, trying to escape the horror that had suddenly descended upon the event. Sarah's eyes flicked to the left, where she saw another parent, a man, grabbing his son and pushing through the crowd, a look of horror painted across his face. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked for any sign of safety. But it wasn't just her son that she needed to get to now, it was Karen. Max! Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. Max, look at me. Max didn't respond immediately. His gaze was locked onto Karen, whose stance remained rigid, her expression cold, almost defiant. Sarah could see the way Max's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow, his hands shaking around the sword. She could see the conflict in his eyes, a battle between fear and determination. He didn't want to show weakness, not in front of the people who had come to see him succeed. She sprinted down the aisle, her body moving on autopilot, driven by the instinct to protect her son. But every second felt like a lifetime. The gunshot had thrown everything into disarray, but it was Karen's cruel words that burned into Sarah's mind. Disabled kids can't be heroes, she had said, almost as if it was a statement of truth. Stay where you are. Karen suddenly shouted, her voice rising in hysteria. You think this is some kind of joke? You all want to make him the hero? You want to make a mockery of our school, of society? Sarah reached the stage, her hands trembling as she stepped onto the platform, her eyes never leaving Max's. Max, baby, listen to me, she said, her voice breaking. This is not your fault. We're going to get through this. I'm here. Max blinked rapidly, as though waking from a daze. His eyes found hers, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of relief in his face. But then, his gaze shifted back to Karen, the words still hanging in the air between them, sharp and cruel. Karen's voice cut through again, louder this time, full of fury. You all should have known this would happen. You put him up there like he's just like everyone else. But he's not. He can't be the hero. He'll never be the hero. None of them can. You can't change what's in their blood. They'll always be broken. At that moment, the tension broke. It was as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, and then all hell broke loose. One of the teachers, a tall, middle-aged woman, rushed toward Karen, her face flushed with anger. That's enough, she shouted, grabbing Karen's arm to pull her away from the stage. You have no right to say those things. But Karen didn't back down. Instead, she yanked her arm free, her eyes wild with a mixture of rage and bitter certainty. You think I'm the problem? The real problem is that you people want to make heroes out of people who don't deserve it. It's all just an illusion. In that moment, something snapped inside Sarah. She had tried so hard to be patient, to ignore Karen's cruel words over the years. But now, her son was hurting. Max had been wounded, not just physically by the chaos of the moment, but emotionally by Karen's words, which she knew would stay with him long after the incident was over. Max's shoulders hunched as he finally stepped back from the center stage. The audience, still in shock, watched as the tension reached its peak, everyone waiting for something, anything, to restore order. It wasn't just the shooting that had shattered the evening, it was the way Karen had used it to fuel her hatred, to strip away the hope that Max had fought so hard for. And as Sarah looked into her son's eyes, she knew the journey they were about to take wasn't just about justice, it was about something deeper, something that would change their lives forever. The chaos continued to swirl around them, but Sarah knew one thing for sure, this was just the beginning. The story of Max's heroism wasn't going to end here. Not as long as she was breathing. The room was chaos. The harsh lights flickered above as Sarah's legs moved almost without thinking, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a rush of panic. Max was still on the stage, his body trembling. The gunshot had shattered the air, but what had broken Sarah's heart was the look in her son's eyes. Max was no longer the brave, defiant hero she had watched with pride just moments ago. He was her son again, vulnerable, frightened, and too young to understand why his world had been turned upside down. Max, she cried, her voice strangled as she reached the foot of the stage. The chaos of the room seemed to quiet as Sarah's desperate voice carried through the crowd. She barely registered the frantic calls of parents, the cries of children, the sound of heels pounding against the floor as people rushed to the exits. All that mattered was getting to Max. Max's eyes locked onto hers, wide and filled with confusion. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling as he stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The wooden sword he had been holding just moments ago now dangled loosely from his hand, his knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. Sarah climbed onto the stage, her heart aching as she moved toward him. She reached out, her hands trembling as they touched his arm, the warmth of his skin almost a relief. She hadn't realized until now how badly she had been holding her breath. Max, baby, it's okay. It's okay, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she pulled him into her arms. He didn't respond, his body stiff and unmoving. The scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the heavy atmosphere of fear and confusion. Sarah looked around, searching for anyone who could help. But no one came forward. The other children were huddled in small groups, some crying, some whispering in fear. The parents who remained in their seats seemed paralyzed, unsure of what to do, as though waiting for someone to take control of the situation. In the distance, Sarah spotted a police officer entering through the side door, his uniform crisp and his face unreadable. Behind him, another officer followed. The police officers were moving toward the stage, their eyes scanning the crowd, searching for any sign of the shooter or anyone who might have caused the disruption. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wanted to shield Max from the questions, from the scrutiny that was about to come. But she knew that wasn't an option anymore. They would need answers. She would need answers. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The officer's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. He was standing in front of her now, his eyes on Max, who was still in her arms. Sarah started, but her voice caught. "My son. He's hurt. Please, help him." The officer stepped closer, his face unreadable as he crouched down to assess Max. His eyes flicked between Max and Sarah, assessing the situation. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Do you know what happened? Was anyone else involved?" Sarah's pulse quickened. She felt her throat tighten as she struggled to keep her composure. Max's wide eyes stared at the officer, still lost in confusion. She nodded, her fingers running through Max's hair as she tried to steady herself. "It was Karen, she shot at us. She said he couldn't be the hero because he's disabled." Her voice wavered with the weight of the words. "It doesn't make sense. She shot him, she tried to shoot him." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "We're going to need to speak with her, ma'am. And we'll need you to stay here." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the officer raised a hand. "Please, ma'am. We just need to ask you some questions. We'll get your son medical attention." Max's eyes flickered toward Sarah, and she nodded softly, trying to reassure him. She kept her grip on him tight, not wanting to let go, but she knew that they needed help. The authorities were here, but something in her gut told her this wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. She had never imagined something like this happening. No one could have. The officer stepped back, signaling for another officer to take over. A third officer was already moving toward the back of the auditorium, where Karen had been standing moments earlier. Sarah could see the dark-haired woman, standing near the exit, her posture tense, her face pale but composed. Karen was not running, not cowering. She looked strangely calm, even though everything had descended into chaos around her. The officer approached Karen, and for a moment, they exchanged words Sarah couldn't hear. But she could see Karen's lips moving, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. She was explaining something. Justifying something. "She's not sorry," Sarah muttered under her breath, her stomach churning. "She's not even sorry." Max shifted slightly in her arms, his breathing still shallow. Sarah kept her voice steady as she spoke to him. "Max, I'm right here. You're going to be okay, I promise. We'll figure this out." But Max wasn't listening. His eyes were on Karen, watching her with an intensity Sarah hadn't seen before. His lips parted, but no words came out. Sarah's heart ached for him. He had been through so much already. But now his pain was being magnified by the way the world around him was treating him, like a disabled kid, unworthy of the same chances as anyone else. Sarah glanced at the officers again. The one who had spoken to her earlier was now talking to another parent, trying to get more details about the events that had unfolded. But Sarah could see that they were struggling to understand what had happened, what had driven Karen to do something like this. From the corner of her eye, Sarah noticed Karen speaking again, her voice raising just enough for Sarah to hear. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Karen was saying, her tone surprisingly calm. "I was just trying to make a point. No one understands. They've been putting him up there like he's just like the rest of them. He shouldn't be the hero. He's not." The coldness in her voice was like a slap to Sarah's face. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was calculated. Karen had been harboring resentment, brewing hatred. Sarah's anger flared, but she held herself back. Not now. She couldn't risk making things worse, not in front of Max. The officer, still listening intently, glanced back at Sarah and gave a small nod. He hadn't said much, but it was clear that the situation was escalating. This wasn't just about a single act of violence, it was about something deeper, something twisted. The words "hero" and "disabled" lingered in the air, heavier than ever. Max had earned his place. But in Karen's mind, there was no room for someone like him in the role she had always envisioned for herself and her own children. The pieces were starting to come together, but the truth was more complicated than Sarah had imagined. This wasn't just a shooting, it was a message. And that message was a declaration of war. The night felt longer than it should have. Sarah sat beside Max in the hospital room, the sterile white walls doing little to ease the tension in her chest. Max had been physically unharmed by the gunshot. Thankfully, he had been shielded by a stage prop when the chaos erupted, but the emotional damage was raw, evident in the way his eyes kept flitting to the door, as if he expected Karen to walk in at any moment with more cruel words. The bullet, though missing him, had struck deep within Sarah's heart. The words Karen had spoken echoed in her mind. "A disabled kid can't be the hero." Those words weren't just spoken in anger, they were a statement of belief. A belief that had festered in Karen for years, growing into something more sinister and violent. And now, it had exploded into the one moment that Sarah had feared for so long, her son being violently attacked simply because of who he was. Max hadn't spoken much since the incident. He had been quiet, distant, but Sarah could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He was ashamed, hurt, and angry all at once. And she knew that, like her, he was trying to figure out how to move forward. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her hand gently brushing through his hair. "We'll get through this together." Max didn't respond, but his eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of something in them, resolve. He wasn't going to let Karen's words define him. Not again. Sarah stood up, pacing the small hospital room, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do now? How could she make sure this never happened again, not just for Max, but for every other child who had to face the cruel bias Karen had spewed so casually? Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was a text from her lawyer, Darren. He had been in touch with the authorities, and though the police were still sorting through the evidence, it was clear that Karen's actions were premeditated. That wasn't just a random shooting, it was a message. The message that disabled kids didn't belong in the spotlight. That Max didn't deserve his moment as a hero. But it was a message that Sarah would not accept. She grabbed the phone and typed back quickly, "We'll pursue this. Max deserves justice. No one will silence him." The response came a few minutes later, "I'll start preparing the case. It's going to be difficult, but we have a strong case. Let's take this to court." Sarah read the message again. Her pulse quickened. It felt like the right decision, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Karen had connections in the community, and some would sympathize with her, especially those who shared her narrow views. But Sarah wasn't going to let that stop her. Not when it came to protecting her son. Not when it came to fighting for his future. Max's voice broke the silence, his words soft but steady. "Mom, do you think it was my fault?" Sarah's heart wrenched at the question. She turned to him, her face softening. "Max, no. This has nothing to do with you. You've done nothing wrong. I wanted to prove everyone wrong, you know? I wanted to be the hero, Max murmured, his gaze dropping to his lap. But maybe Karen was right. Maybe I shouldn't have tried so hard. Sarah's chest tightened. She moved to his side and knelt down, taking his hand in hers. Max, listen to me. Karen was wrong. She was so wrong. You're the hero of your own story. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've always been brave, always. Max looked up at her, his eyes still uncertain but filled with a spark of hope. I'm proud of you, Max. For standing tall, for showing everyone that you can do anything, despite what others think. And I'm going to fight for you. I'll make sure the world sees who you really are. The hero you already are. Max gave a faint smile, nodding slowly. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step toward healing, a small step toward reclaiming what Karen had tried to take away. Sarah stood up, her resolve hardening. She had made up her mind. She couldn't just let this go. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about setting a precedent. She wasn't going to let anyone, especially Karen, dictate who Max could be or how he should live his life. The door to the room creaked open, and in walked Darren, the lawyer. His expression was calm, but Sarah could see the fire in his eyes. He had always been passionate about defending the underdog, and he understood what this case meant, not just for Max, but for the entire disabled community. Any updates? Sarah asked, her voice steady, though her hands were still trembling. Darren pulled up a chair, sitting beside her. The police are gathering evidence, and the case is solid. But I want to warn you, it's going to be an uphill battle. Karen will fight tooth and nail, and she'll have people backing her, especially in a community like this. You'll face a lot of resistance. Sarah nodded, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She had never wanted her life to be this complicated. She had never imagined a world where her son had to fight for his right to exist, to be seen as an equal. But now, there was no turning back. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm. We have to fight for Max. We have to fight for every kid like him who deserves a chance to be seen and heard. I won't let Karen take this from him. Darren looked at her, a respectful nod in his direction. I knew you'd say that. I'll get to work on the paperwork. We'll need everything, witness statements, footage from the play, and I'll arrange for a psychological evaluation for Max, just to assess the emotional damage. Sarah's mind raced. It was a lot to take in, but she knew they had to be thorough. Karen's actions had wounded more than just Max physically, it had stripped him of his confidence, his belief that he could be something more than what others saw him as. But that was about to change. Max needed to know that this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. I'll be with you every step of the way, Sarah promised, turning back to Max. Max's eyes locked with hers. There was still a lot of fear in them, but there was something else too, something stronger. A flicker of the hero he was destined to be. And with that, Sarah vowed that no matter the cost, she would rebuild the fight, not just for Max, but for every child who had been silenced by cruelty. No more. Not anymore. The courtroom was tense. The air was thick with the weight of the case, a simmering undercurrent of anticipation vibrating through the room as both sides prepared for the confrontation. The wooden benches were filled with an assortment of people, some there out of genuine concern, others merely curious about the drama unfolding in their small community. Sarah sat at the front, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze focused on the judge who was preparing to call the case. Max sat beside her, his eyes cast downward, his fingers nervously drumming on the armrest of his seat. He hadn't said much since they'd entered the courtroom, but Sarah could feel the tension in his body, the fear still lingering beneath his composed exterior. She knew that every moment of this trial was another hurdle he had to jump, and yet, she also knew that they had come too far to back down now. Across from them, Karen sat with her lawyer, an air of confidence about her that made Sarah's blood boil. She had come prepared for this battle, no doubt. Karen was dressed impeccably, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her posture rigid and defiant. It was as if she was daring them to challenge her, as if she knew the weight of her influence and wasn't afraid to use it. The trial had been building for weeks, the tension between the families escalating with each passing day. What had started as a violent outburst in the auditorium had turned into a full-fledged legal war. Sarah knew that this wasn't just about proving Max's innocence, it was about exposing Karen for what she truly was, a woman willing to destroy the lives of those she deemed lesser, in order to protect her own warped views of the world. The judge's gavel rang out, signaling the start of the proceedings. "Court is now in session," the judge said, his voice echoing in the room. He was an older man, his face lined with the weight of experience, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, was uncomfortable with the nature of this case. "We will begin with the plaintiff's statement. Mrs. Thompson." Sarah stood, her legs shaking slightly as she walked to the front of the courtroom. Her lawyer, Darren, stood beside her, his presence a reassuring anchor. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, the pressure mounting with each step. She had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the emotional toll of standing in front of Karen, knowing what she had done to her son. "Thank you, Your Honor," Darren said as he addressed the court. "Today, we are here because of a senseless act of violence, a violent act driven by ignorance and prejudice. My client, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, and her son, Max, have suffered not just physically but emotionally, as Karen Wilson, a mother, a member of this community, decided that Max, a disabled child, did not deserve his moment of triumph. She decided that Max, simply by existing as he is, could not be a hero. And in doing so, she attempted to destroy him." Sarah's voice caught in her throat as Darren continued, but she managed to keep her composure. She knew the power of the words, the weight of her son's story, and the impact it could have on the court. This was the moment that could change everything. Darren continued, laying out the events of the night in the auditorium, how Karen's outburst had led to the gunshot, how she had justified her actions by claiming that a disabled child couldn't be a hero. He detailed the emotional trauma Max had suffered, the long nights of restless sleep, the therapy sessions, and the effects it had had on their entire family. Each word felt like a dagger, but it was necessary. They needed to show the court what this act had really done. "And it's not just the gunshot," Darren said, his voice growing more intense. "It's the message Karen sent to everyone in that room, and the message she sent to my client and her son. That message was, you are not enough. You are not worthy of being seen as equal." Sarah's heart ached as she looked at Max, who still hadn't lifted his gaze. He was a hero, despite everything. He had always been. The courtroom fell silent as Karen's lawyer stood to present her defense. "Your Honor, we do not deny that a tragic event occurred that night," Karen's lawyer began, his voice smooth, calculated. "But we must ask, what was the provocation?" Max Thompson, despite his disability, was given a role that was far beyond his capabilities. The nature of the play, and his participation, was a reflection of how the school and his mother pushed him into something he wasn't equipped for. And yes, Karen Wilson did make a comment, however, it was never meant to incite violence. It was a cry of frustration over what she saw as an unfair advantage being given to Max simply because of his disability. Sarah's blood boiled at the words. She stood up, unable to keep quiet any longer. "That is a lie." Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Max didn't need any advantage. He earned that role. He earned every moment of it. It wasn't given to him because of pity or because of some kind of agenda, it was his right as much as anyone else's." The judge banged his gavel, calling the room to order. "Mrs. Thompson," the judge said, his tone stern. "Please, allow your attorney to speak." Sarah sat back down, but her body was tense, every muscle coiled with anger. She couldn't let Karen's lawyer paint her son as a victim, as someone who was pushed into something they didn't deserve. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the truth. But before anyone could speak again, a new twist came, something neither side had anticipated. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, stepping forward with a file in hand. "We've obtained new evidence. A recording." The room grew still as the prosecutor played the recording from the night of the incident. It was Karen's voice, unmistakable, and it cut through the tension like a knife. "You all should have known this would happen," Karen's voice echoed in the courtroom. "A disabled kid can't be the hero. He'll never be the hero. None of them can. You can't change what's in their blood. They'll always be broken." The room was silent for a long moment. Karen's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock, realizing the magnitude of her words being exposed. Sarah's heart raced. The truth was out now. Karen's words, her hatred, had been captured. And this was going to be the evidence that would change everything. The judge looked at Karen's lawyer, his gaze stern. "Mrs. Wilson, can you explain these comments?" Karen's lawyer faltered, the words stuck in his throat. He began, but Karen cut him off. "I didn't mean it that way," Karen stammered, her voice shaky now. "It was just frustration." "Frustration?" Sarah's voice was steady, unwavering. "You took a gun into a school and shot at my son because of your frustration? That's not frustration, that's malice." The judge's gaze hardened. "This will be taken into consideration. The court will adjourn for the day, and we will resume tomorrow." As the room began to empty, Sarah looked at Karen, who was trying to regain her composure, but it was clear now that the tables had turned. The words that Karen had spoken, the cruel actions she had taken, had been exposed for what they were, an attack on Max's dignity, on his very right to exist as he was. Max had been the hero all along. And now, the world would know it. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been, the tension in the air palpable as the judge called for the final statements. Sarah sat at the edge of her seat, her heart still racing as the culmination of months of pain, doubt, and relentless determination bore down on her. The weight of the case had taken its toll, but now, in this final moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Max sat beside her, his body a little less tense than it had been in the past few days, though the emotional scars still lingered. His hands rested in his lap, his fingers intertwined, a small indication of the nerve still running beneath his calm exterior. He had come so far since that night at the play, so much had happened since the moment Karen's cruel words had shattered their lives. But now, Max was no longer the scared boy who had been caught in a violent situation. He was growing stronger every day, learning how to reclaim what had been taken from him. "I'm proud of you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Max looked at her, his eyes still unsure but filled with gratitude. They had come this far, but the true weight of their journey hadn't fully hit him yet. It was only in moments like this, in the face of the trial's resolution, that they could see how far they had come. The defense attorney stood, his voice trembling slightly as he attempted to salvage some hope for Karen. "Your Honor," he began, his hands shaking as he held up the defense file, "we stand by our client's actions as those of frustration and misjudgment, not malice. The intent was never to harm but to express concern over Max Thompson's participation in a role that he was, frankly, not equipped for." There was a murmur from the gallery. Sarah felt a swell of anger rise within her. She knew what Karen had done, she knew the depth of her cruelty. Karen's words, her actions, had been deliberate, filled with hate masked as concern. And now, her lawyer was trying to spin it into something less sinister. But the truth could not be hidden. The recordings, the evidence, the testimonies, all of it told a story Karen couldn't escape. The judge's gaze was stern as he addressed the court. "Mrs. Wilson, your defense has failed to explain the gravity of the situation adequately. The evidence against you is overwhelming." The courtroom fell into a thick silence. Karen's face was pale, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for some kind of escape. But there was nowhere to run now. Her own words, her own hate, had been her undoing. "Your Honor," Darren, Sarah's lawyer, stood and addressed the judge with finality. "We have shown, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Karen Wilson's actions were not a mere outburst of frustration. She planned her attack. She used her words and a firearm to carry out a violent act against a child based solely on his disability. Her motives were clear from the moment she decided to make Max a target. And the emotional and psychological trauma inflicted upon Max is irreversible." Sarah glanced at Max, whose eyes were locked on the proceedings, his face a mix of sadness and growing strength. He had been through so much, his dignity stripped away, his confidence shattered, and yet, here he was, sitting tall beside his mother. The road ahead would still be difficult, but he was beginning to understand that he had survived something unimaginable, and he had done it with courage. The judge's gavel struck, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Mrs. Wilson," the judge said, his voice firm. "You have been found guilty of endangering the life of a child and causing severe emotional and psychological harm. You will face the full consequences of your actions." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now, as the words sank in, a sense of relief washed over her, though it was not without its own complexity. Justice had been served, but it could never undo the damage Karen had inflicted upon her son, upon their family. Karen's face crumpled. She had expected this, perhaps. After all, the evidence had been undeniable, but that didn't make the sting of defeat any less sharp. She stood, her hands trembling as she was escorted out of the courtroom, her eyes avoiding everyone, especially Sarah's. Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her own emotions press against her chest. It was over. Max was safe. He would finally have the chance to rebuild, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady. She turned to Max, who had finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You did it," Max whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling. "No, Max. We did it. You fought for yourself, and I fought with you. You're a hero, always have been." Max took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. His eyes, though still filled with the weight of what had happened, held something else now: strength, defiance, and the certainty that he could overcome anything. The relief that washed over Sarah was profound, but there was something else there too, a reflection on everything they had gone through. The pain had been unbearable, but it had also shaped them, forged them into something stronger than they were before. For all the cruelty they had faced, they had emerged unbroken. And now, they could look forward to a future that was no longer overshadowed by Karen's words or actions. Sarah walked toward the exit, Max by her side. As they stepped out into the hallway, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt different. It felt like a new beginning. Max had found his voice again, and Sarah had rediscovered her own strength in the process. They had won, not just the case, but something deeper: the right to live without fear, without shame. "We're going to be okay," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on Max's shoulder. Max nodded, his face lifting with a faint but genuine smile. "Yeah, Mom. We're going to be okay." And in that moment, Sarah knew that the fight wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, but now, they could face them with the strength of everything they had fought for. They had been tested, and they had come through stronger. Together. The sunlight felt different as it poured through the hospital windows. The sterile white walls that had once felt suffocating now seemed to breathe with a new kind of energy: light, warmth, possibility. Max and Sarah stood side by side, looking out at the city below, the hum of life continuing around them. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of calm, an almost tangible relief that settled between them. Max had changed. The fear, the doubt, the feeling of inadequacy that had plagued him for so long were beginning to fade. There was still a long way to go: therapy, self-discovery, learning how to trust the world again, but they had survived. Together. And that, in itself, felt like a victory. "Do you feel different?" Sarah asked softly, her hand resting on Max's shoulder. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but the question had been on her mind ever since the trial ended. Max paused for a moment, looking out at the horizon as if weighing the future against the past. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I think I do. I don't know exactly how, but I do." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. He wasn't the same boy he had been before that night at the play, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. He had been tested, pushed to the brink, and come out the other side stronger. A sudden knock on the door broke their quiet moment. It was Darren, their lawyer, standing in the doorway with a file in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. "I just wanted to update you both," Darren said, stepping into the room. "The case is officially closed. Karen Wilson is facing criminal charges for endangering a child, and there will be a full investigation into her actions. It's not over for her yet." The words were like a final stamp of justice, but as Darren spoke, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. It wasn't just about winning the case. It wasn't just about exposing Karen for what she had done. The real work, healing, moving forward, was only just beginning. Max looked up at Darren, his expression thoughtful. "What happens to her now?" Darren's gaze faltered, the weight of the question settling heavily in the room. "We don't know yet. But there's one thing I can tell you, this isn't the last chapter in her story." Sarah exchanged a glance with Max. The possibility of Karen's future, her consequences, her actions, still lingered in the air like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. As they stood there, the uncertainty of what lay ahead felt both daunting and liberating. Karen's influence had been shaken, but Sarah knew she wouldn't go down quietly. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the question lingered, would Karen ever truly face the consequences of her actions? But for now, Sarah and Max had won. Their story wasn't defined by what had happened in that auditorium, it was defined by the strength they had shown in the face of adversity. Together, they had found their voice. And with that, they could face whatever the future held.